When was the last time she looked at you, like she truly believed you still saw her? Not the man who checks off the to-do list, not the one who shows up, pays the bills, or mows the lawn, but you, the man who once held her with both hands, and both eyes, the one who made her feel like the only woman in the world, even when the room was full. But now, she walks past you in the hallway, and the space between you feels colder than it used to. Not icy, just empty. You sleep 6 inches apart, but it feels like 6 miles, and not because of anger, but because of absence. And the hardest part, you don't know when it started. There was no big fight, no betrayal, no storm, only silence. Not the angry, kind, but the kind that arrives softly in moments missed and words left unsaid. A slow, drifting distance that slipped in while you were trying so hard to do everything right. You're still there, still showing up, still doing your part. But deep down, you feel it, that quiet ache in your chest, that sense of lack, of something missing, something lost. You miss her, and maybe, just maybe, she misses being seen. This isn't about blame. It's not about doing more. It's about remembering a truth so quiet. Most men don't hear it until it's almost too late. A truth shared by a 72-year-old woman who's helped more couples come back from the edge than any counselor, podcast, or marriage book ever could. Because what she told one man changed everything. If you've ever felt that distance, if you've ever looked at the woman you love and wondered when she stopped looking back, drop a 1 in the comments. Have you ever felt this way? If so, share a moment when the silence hit you hardest. You're not the only one, and if you've found your way back to each other, even just a little, drop a 2, because someone else needs to believe it's still possible. Now, let me tell you about Mark, a good man who was losing the woman he loved. Until a quiet conversation with a wise woman in the hills showed him how to see her again, as if for the first time, a good man who almost lost the woman he loved. It wasn't a lack of love. It was the absence of truly seeing her. That moment, the one that changed everything, began with a man named Mark, a man who'd done everything right and still felt something slipping away. Mark was 62, married for 36 years. He'd done what most would call everything right, loyal, reliable, always providing. He never missed a birthday, paid the bills on time, brought her morning coffee. On paper, he was the perfect husband, but something precious had gone missing. No fights, no betrayal, no drama, just silence. Not the kind that scream, but the kind that lingers. The kind that settles between two people like dust on a once-loved piano. They still shared a bed, still talked about the bills, still asked what. In time the grandkids were coming over, but when he reached for her at night, she turned just slightly, as if bracing. When he spoke, she nodded but didn't look up from her book. He told himself it was just routine, life, a phase. But deep down, he knew better. He missed her laugh. He missed the way her eyes used to light up when he walked into the room. Now she barely looked at him, not with anger, not with resentment, just absence. And that scared him more than any fight ever could, because he didn't know how to fix something that didn't seem broken on the outside. One night she went to bed early. No kiss, no good night. Just a quiet, "I'm tired." And the door clicked shut. Mark sat alone in the living room, the glow of the TV flickering on the walls, the house feeling colder than usual. That's when he remembered something his mother once said. He was just a boy then. She was folding laundry, now talking about his father, who'd grown distant for a while. "If your heart ever feels lost in love," she said, "go see the woman in the hills." Back then, he'd thought it was just a saying, some old wives' tale. But now he wasn't. So sure, because sitting in that chair, heart heavy and hands still, he felt more lost than he'd ever admit out loud, and something in him whispered, "Go." And when the night finally gave way to morning, Mark knew what he had to do, even if he didn't know exactly why. The next morning, Mark woke up early. Not because he had a plan, but because something inside him felt too loud to ignore. He wrote a note on the counter. Didn't say where he was going, just that he needed to clear his head. Then he packed a small bag, a change of clothes, a worn-out notebook, and his wedding ring, which he hadn't taken off in 36 years, and he drove. He drove past the noise, past empty parking lots, and the pieces of a life that had grown too quiet. As the road narrowed and fog swept over the hills, the world slowed with him, like it knew he was heading somewhere important. He didn't use a GPS, didn't need one. Somehow, he knew where he was going. His mother had spoken about it like it was myth. A cottage hidden deep in the hills. A woman who helped lost hearts remember where they'd once belonged. It sounded ridiculous when he was younger, but now he was desperate enough to believe in anything that might show him what he couldn't see on his own. After hours of winding roads and tall pines, he found it. Just like she'd described. A cottage, old and alive, wrapped in ivy, so thick it looked like the forest was trying to hold it in place. A small stone path curved toward the front porch. Herbs hung in bunches from the beams, and in the stillness of it all, something stirred inside him, like he was standing at the edge of something ancient and important. He hesitated at the door, his hand hovering above the old brass knocker. But before he could lift it, the door creaked open. There she was, older than he'd expected. Hair silver and loose, falling down her back like a ribbon of time, eyes that looked straight through him without judgment. Not soft, not harsh, just knowing. She didn't ask his name, didn't ask what brought him. She just looked at him for a long moment, then stepped aside. "You've carried this long enough," she said. "Come in." He stepped inside, not just into her home, but into a space where truth had room to breathe. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and chamomile. The fire crackled gently, casting golden light across the old wooden walls. Mark sat down slowly, as if the weight of everything he'd been carrying was just now asking to be set down. Amalia didn't speak. She poured tea, 2 cups, and placed one in front of him. No questions, no small talk, just stillness. For the first time in a long time, Mark let the silence sit. He wrapped his hands around the warm mug, gazed into the fire, and finally said, "I don't know how we got here." His voice was low, worn. "She's still my wife, but I feel like a stranger in my own home." Amalia didn't flinch. She didn't try to reassure him. She just nodded like she'd heard that sentence more times than anyone should have to. Then she leaned in, her voice soft, but strong enough to carry truth. "Love doesn't just vanish," Amalia said. "It dries up when it stops being noticed. Most couples don't fall out of love. They fall out of paying attention." He swallowed hard. "I thought staying faithful was enough," he said. "I show up. I don't run. I try." Amalia nodded. "That's the trouble with most good men. You do so much, but sometimes you forget to notice." "Notice what?" he asked quietly. The way her voice softens when she's tired, the way she looks down when she feels unseen, the days she doesn't ask for help, but needs it the most. "She doesn't need you to do more," Amalia said gently. "She needs you to see more." Mark looked back at the fire. His mind ran through moments he'd missed, the distracted nods, the empty "I love yous" said out of habit, the way her hand had stopped reaching for his during walks, and how he never thought to reach first. "She never said anything," he whispered. "She did," Amalia replied. "You just weren't listening with your eyes." Mark didn't answer. He just sat there, in the quiet crackle of firelight, realizing maybe love doesn't leave, Maybe it just waits. As the fire cracked softly between them, Amalia leaned forward, not with judgment, but with something deeper, understanding. Amalia didn't scold him. She didn't shame him. She just looked at him with eyes that had seen this story unfold too, many times. Most men, she said gently, think closeness begins with touch. Mark looked up. But for women, she continued, it begins far earlier. In the pause before words, in how you breathe when she's near, in whether your eyes still look for her, even when she isn't speaking. She leaned forward slightly, her voice just above a whisper, but it carried like thunder. If a woman's heart feels unseen, she starts to emotionally withdraw, not out of anger, not out of rejection, but to protect something that no longer feels safe being offered. Mark felt his chest tighten. He hadn't expected the truth to land like that. I mean, we talk, he said. We go through the day together, we laugh sometimes. But do you ask how she's really feeling? Amalia asked, her tone warm but firm. Not just how her day was, not if she remembered the doctor's appointment, not about errands, or bills. I mean her, the woman beneath the role. Mark hesitated. Do you ask what she's afraid of lately? What makes her feel beautiful now? What she misses from the girl she used to be? He stared at the floor. Amalia pressed gently. And when you reach for her hand, is it because you truly miss her presence? Or because you're looking for something in return? He closed his eyes. He already knew the answer. She nodded slowly. When a woman doesn't feel seen, she said, she doesn't slam the door. She fades, quietly, softly, like mist in the morning, and by the time most men notice, she's already half gone. Mark felt the weight of it all settle in his gut, because deep down, he remembered a time when she glowed, just being near him, when her laughter used to wrap around a room. And now, he couldn't remember the last time she looked him in the eyes for longer than a moment. She's still there, Amalia said softly, but she's waiting to see if you are. Her words didn't just land. They settled. And in that moment, something in Mark began to shift. Mark leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, voice low. So, what do I do now? He wasn't asking like a man who needed steps. He was asking like someone ready to change. Amalia didn't answer right away. She refilled his cup, slowly, then set the teapot down. Start, she said. Where love first lived. Mark looked at her, unsure. In curiosity, she added, in playfulness, in softness, in the little things that didn't feel like effort back then, because they were filled with wonder. She smiled gently. Leave her a note tomorrow. Morning, not a long one, just something that says, I still think about you. All the time. He nodded, but she wasn't finished. Leave her a note before you head to work, just a line to say she's on your mind. Check in during the day and ask how she's feeling. Not just what she needs. It's those small, thoughtful acts that remind her she still matters to you. Let her feel that she's still beautiful, without condition. Mark's throat tightened. When's the last time you looked at her? Amalia asked, like she was still a mystery worth discovering. He didn't answer. She leaned back, her eyes never leaving his. Ask her about her dreams, she continued, but not the big ones, the little ones. The ones she let go of when the kids came, or when the bills got tight, or when she stopped, believing she had time for herself. Ask her what scares her these days, not just health stuff, but the things she doesn't say out loud. Ask her what she misses, about herself, about you, about the way life used to feel. Mark sat there, motionless. How do I respond? He finally whispered. You don't, Amalia said. Not at first. When she answers, don't. Try to fix it, don't offer advice, don't make it about you. She held her tea to her lips, paused. Just hold it. Hold her truth like it's sacred. Mark let that sink in. Because when a woman feels emotionally understood, she said, her heart opens again, not because she's convinced, but because she feels safe showing up. And in that safety, the closeness returns. not all at once, but piece by piece, the kind of connection that doesn't just fill the room, it settles in the soul. And then, quietly, intentionally, Amalia rose, as if retrieving something sacred from memory. Amalia stood slowly and walked to a small shelf near the window. She ran her fingers over the spines of worn books, then pulled out a leather-bound notebook. The corners were soft with age, the cover cracked with time. She returned to the table, set it down gently in front of Mark, and opened to a page already marked. "These," she said, tapping the paper, "are the 3 habits I've seen. Revive even the most tired kind of love." Mark leaned closer, his eyes scanning her careful handwriting. The first habit she shared was simple, but powerful: emotional presence. "Be with her when you're with her," she said. "Put down your phone. Turn off the game. Turn your body toward hers. And when you ask, don't just say, 'How was your day?' Ask what made her smile, what weighed on her. Let her know her inner world matters to you." Mark nodded slowly. Then she spoke of the next one: unexpected affection, the kind that doesn't ask or expect, but simply gives. Routine touch, Amalia said, isn't the same as real affection. She knows what a goodnight kiss feels like. She knows what closeness feels like when there's unspoken expectation behind it. "But what makes her heart open again?" she asked, a hand on her back while she's making coffee, a kiss on the forehead while she's talking, a gentle squeeze of her hand, just to remind her, "I still choose you." Mark blinked, his throat tight. He remembered doing those things. He remembered why he did them. And lastly, daily appreciation, the quiet recognition that keeps a woman's spirit lifted, especially when she pretends she doesn't need it. "Tell her she's strong," Amalia said softly. "Tell her she's still beautiful, even if she rolls her eyes. Especially if she rolls her eyes. Tell her you're proud to be her husband, that you see how hard she tries." Mark sat in silence. His fingers grazed the edge of the notebook. "I used to do all of this," he said quietly. Amalia smiled. "And you still can. Love doesn't fade because we get older. It fades because we stop tending it. But here's the beautiful part." She reached across the table, rested her hand on his. "It comes back the moment you show up, fully, attentively, daily, not with perfection, but with presence." Mark looked down at her hand. Something had shifted. He didn't have a plan. He didn't need one. Just a quiet knowing in his chest that it was time to go home and begin again. After hearing Amalia's words, something inside him shifted, not with a plan, but with quiet certainty. It was time to go back and begin again, and with Amalia's voice still echoing softly in his mind, Mark took that notebook of wisdom and returned to the woman he had never stopped loving. Mark went home that evening, no plan, no speech, just a quiet readiness in his chest. He didn't wait for the right moment, didn't wait for the tension to disappear. He simply walked into the living room and sat beside the woman he'd loved for most of his life. She was scrolling her phone. Soft music played in the background, the kind of moment most couples sleepwalk through. But this time, Mark reached for her hand, not to fix, not to make it about anything else, just to hold it. And then, in a voice that trembled slightly, he said, "I missed you today." She looked up. Her eyes searched his, not with suspicion, not with confusion, with something else. Surprise, recognition, emotion. And maybe, for the first time in years, she felt seen. "Brother, if you're still here, this part is for you. You don't need to start over, you just need to start again." Because love doesn't disappear in a single moment. It fades slowly, one missed glance, one unspoken truth at a time. But those moments, they can be turned around. That's where the healing begins. Not with grand gestures, with small ones that mean more. Touch her hand, look into her eyes, Ask her the question you used to breeze past. Not just, how was your day, but how are you, really? Because that question isn't just about her mood. It tells her you're not just checking a box. It says you see the woman behind the roles, that you're still curious, still present, and still willing to listen, not to fix, but to understand. Love isn't lost all at once. It fades in the routine, in the glances we stop giving, in the words we stop speaking, and it's rebuilt the same way. One choice, one moment, one quiet act of presence. If this reached you, comment below. Share it with a man who might need to remember, because love isn't a spark you wait for. It's a fire you tend every single day.